Picture this. You walk into a museum, and on the wall hangs a painting of Jesus. Long brown hair, light skin, soft blue eyes, a warm golden glow around his head. You've seen this image 1,000 times, in churches, in movies, in textbooks, maybe even in your own home. And for most people, it just feels right. It feels like him. But here's the question nobody asks out loud. Where did that image actually come from? Because here's the thing that historians don't talk about enough on YouTube. That image wasn't painted anywhere near where Jesus lived. It wasn't created by people who knew him, or people who looked like him, or people who even lived in the same century as him. It was created centuries later, in Europe, by European artists who painted Jesus the way they imagined someone holy should look. And somehow, that version became the default image for the entire world. So today, we're going to ask the question that a lot of people have thought about, but very few have actually explored carefully. What did Jesus really look like? Not based on tradition, not based on what we grew up seeing, based on history, based on archaeology, based on the actual world he lived in. And I want you to stay with me here, because the answer is more layered than most people expect. Before we go further, be honest for a second. When you close your eyes and picture Jesus right now, what do you actually see? Drop it in the comments, because I think the answers are going to be more interesting than you expect. Let's get into it. Here's where things get genuinely surprising. The Bible doesn't describe what Jesus looked like, not once. No mention of his height, no mention of his eye color, no mention of his skin tone, no mention of whether he was tall or short, heavy or lean. For someone who is arguably the most talked about figure in all of human history, the physical description is completely absent. Think about that for a second. We have detailed descriptions of battles that happened thousands of years ago. We have records of what certain Roman emperors looked like. We have writings about the physical appearance of ancient kings. But Jesus, the most central figure in Christianity, and the Gospels never once stopped to say, by the way, here's what he looked like. And that silence is actually significant. The writers of the Gospels were focused on something else entirely. They were focused on what Jesus said, what he taught, what he did, his message, his mission. Appearance wasn't the point. And in many ways, that makes sense. If you believe the message is everything, then the messenger's face becomes almost irrelevant. But here's the problem that came later. When you leave a blank space in history, human imagination fills it in, and different cultures, different centuries, different artists filled in that blank in very different ways. A church in Ethiopia painted Jesus with dark brown skin and curly black hair. A church in China painted him with East Asian features. A church in medieval Europe painted him with pale skin, straight hair, and European features. All of them filling in the same blank. So the question isn't just, what did Jesus look like? The deeper question is, who got to decide which version became the most widely distributed, and why? Here's something to think about and drop in the comments. If the Bible never describes his appearance, should any one version of his image be considered more correct than another? Let's keep going. To get closer to a historical answer, we have to start with geography. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and spent most of his adult life in Judea and Galilee. These are regions in what we today call the Middle East. In the 1st century, this area was part of the Roman Empire, but the people living there had been living there for thousands of years before Rome ever arrived. Now, think about what life looked like in 1st century Judea. This was a hot, dry, sun-heavy region. The landscape was rugged, the terrain was demanding, agriculture was difficult, water was precious. The people who lived there spent significant parts of their lives outdoors, working, walking, traveling on foot across rocky terrain under an intense Middle Eastern sun. These were not people living in comfortable stone palaces. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, carpenters, people who worked with their hands in a harsh environment. So what does that environment do to a person's appearance over a lifetime? You don't end up looking like a Renaissance painting. You end up looking like someone shaped by the land they lived on. The Jewish population of Judea in the 1st century was part of a broader Semitic group of peoples that had lived in that region for millennia. Scholars and anthropologists who study ancient Middle Eastern populations generally describe them as having medium to darker brown skin tones, dark eyes, and dark, typically curly or wavy hair. This wasn't unusual or controversial. This was simply what the population of that region looked like. And Jesus, growing up in Nazareth, working as a carpenter, spending years walking across Galilee in the heat, would almost certainly have looked like a 1st century Judean man. Not like a Northern European, not like a character from a Renaissance painting, more like someone who belonged to that landscape. Now here's a question I want you to think about. If someone showed you a historically accurate image of a 1st century Judean man standing next to the most famous painting of Jesus, would they look like the same person? That's not a trap question, it's a genuine one. Keep that thought, we're going to come back to it. This is the part of the story that most people have never actually heard explained clearly, and it's the part that changes how you see everything else. In the first few centuries after Jesus lived, there was actually very little visual art depicting him at all. Early Christians were largely focused on written texts, oral tradition, and community practice. They weren't building massive churches filled with paintings yet. In some cases, they were actively avoiding visual representations because of Jewish tradition, which was cautious about creating images of holy figures. The earliest known artistic representations of Jesus date to around the 3rd and 4th centuries. And here's what's interesting. Those early images looked different from what we're familiar with today. Some showed Jesus as a young, clean-shaven figure. Others showed him in a style that clearly borrowed from Roman artistic traditions. The familiar long-haired, bearded image we associate with him today wasn't even the dominant version in the very beginning. So when did the familiar image really take root? As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire and eventually became the official religion of Rome in the 4th century, the religion moved increasingly into European cultural territory, and art followed culture, always. When European artists began depicting Jesus centuries after his life, they painted him the way people in their communities looked. They used local models. They worked within local artistic traditions. This wasn't necessarily a deliberate decision to change history. For many artists, it was simply the most natural way to make the figure feel real and relatable to their audience. And here's the key insight. Art doesn't just reflect reality. It reflects the people creating it. A painter in 15th century Florence was not trying to produce a historically accurate documentary portrait. He was creating an image that spoke to the people around him, that made the sacred feel present, that brought the story into a familiar, recognizable world. Over centuries, as European Christianity became more globally dominant, those European images of Jesus traveled with it. Missionaries carried them, printing presses reproduced them, and the image that had started as a culturally specific artistic interpretation slowly became what billions of people around the world understood as the face of Jesus. That's a remarkable thing to sit with. Here's a question worth debating in the comments. Does that process represent people trying to erase history or simply trying to connect with it in a way that felt personal to them? I'm genuinely curious where you land on that. Now let's look at what researchers actually say when they try to approach this question more rigorously. In the early 2000s, a team of forensic anthropologists and medical artists in the UK took on an interesting project. They used forensic techniques similar to those used in criminal investigations to reconstruct what a 1st century Judean man might have looked like. They weren't claiming to reconstruct Jesus specifically, but they were trying to answer the question, what did someone from that time, that region, and that population look like? They worked from skeletal remains found in the region dating to that period. They analyzed the bone structure, the skull shape, and then used established forensic methods to build out a likely facial reconstruction. The result? A man with dark brown skin, dark eyes, short, tightly coiled or curly dark hair, a broad nose, a thick beard, a face shaped by weather and physical labor. The image looked nothing like the most commonly distributed version of Jesus in Western art. But that wasn't really the point. The researchers themselves were careful to say their work wasn't a portrait of Jesus. It was a portrait of the type of person Jesus likely was, someone from that specific population, that specific time, that specific environment. And what it showed very clearly was this. The first-century Jewish man of Judea almost certainly looked significantly different from the version of Jesus that dominated Western art for hundreds of years. None of this disproves anything about Jesus' life, teachings, or significance. It simply pushes back on one very specific assumption. The assumption that the European artistic tradition somehow captured what Jesus actually looked like. History and science suggest it probably didn't. So here's your question for this section. Which version feels more grounded in reality to you? The one shaped by centuries of tradition, or the one shaped by historical and forensic research? There's no wrong answer, but I want to know where you land. Now, some of you might be watching this and feeling a kind of discomfort right now, and I think that's worth acknowledging directly. For billions of people, the image of Jesus isn't just a historical question. It's personal. It's connected to childhood, to family, to faith, to community, to the most sacred parts of their lives. When someone has grown up seeing a particular image of Jesus in their church, in their home, in their culture, that image isn't just a picture. It becomes woven into the fabric of how they experience their entire belief system. So when a video like this comes along and says, actually, history suggests he probably looked quite different, that can feel like a challenge, even if it isn't meant to be. Humans have always created images of the divine in ways that feel relatable to them. This is true across every religion and every culture in human history. It's not unique to Christianity. It's not unique to European culture. It's deeply human. We reach for the sacred using the tools we have, and our tools always carry the mark of who we are and where we come from. So the European image of Jesus wasn't created out of bad intent. It was created out of a very human impulse to make the extraordinary feel present and near. But here's where the history becomes something worth sitting with. When that one culturally specific image was distributed globally, it sometimes arrived in places where people looked very different from what was in the painting. And for some communities, that created a complicated relationship with the image itself. Some historians have noted how communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America wrestled with images of Jesus that looked more like their colonizers than their neighbors. That's not a political statement. That's a historical observation. Here's a genuine question for the comments. If discovering a more historically accurate image of Jesus looks different from what we've always seen, should we explore that? Sit with it? Or does it feel like it changes something important for you? I'm asking in good faith. I'd love to hear a real conversation below. Let me be honest with you about something. In one sense, this whole discussion might seem like it's missing the point, because the core of what Jesus taught doesn't depend on what he looked like. His teachings about compassion, forgiveness, justice, love, community, the way we treat the people who are suffering around us, none of that changes based on whether his hair was short or long, or whether his skin was darker or lighter. The message doesn't live in the face, it lives in the words. And yet, there's still a reason why this question matters. Not because appearance defines meaning, but because historical accuracy has value. Understanding the real world Jesus lived in, the culture, the politics, the environment, the people around him, that context actually deepens the story. When you understand that Jesus was a first-century Jewish man from an occupied territory, living under Roman rule, speaking to a community facing real poverty and real oppression, the things he said take on more weight, not less. History doesn't compete with belief. At its best, history adds depth to it. It's like the difference between reading a book and also understanding the life the author lived when they wrote it. The book doesn't change, but your understanding of it grows. So here's the question I want to leave you with for this section. Do you think knowing what Jesus really looked like matters? Does it change anything for you, either about the history or the message? Drop your honest answer below. Let's zoom out for a moment, because this question about Jesus and appearance is actually part of a much larger story. Throughout history, powerful images have shaped how people think about the world. The images we grow up with, the faces we associate with figures we consider sacred or important, those images don't come from nowhere. They were created by specific people, in specific places, at specific times, for specific purposes. Sometimes those purposes were purely spiritual, sometimes they were cultural, sometimes they were political. Often, they were all three at once. And when an image gets repeated often enough, and distributed widely enough, and passed down through enough generations, it stops feeling like a creation. It starts feeling like a fact. That's true of Jesus, but it's also true of many other historical figures throughout history. The images we inherit shape what feels normal to us, what feels sacred, what feels true. And sometimes, stepping back to ask where those images came from is one of the most interesting things a curious person can do. Not to tear anything down, not to challenge anyone's faith, but simply to understand the full story. Because history is always more complicated, more layered, and more interesting than any single image can capture. When you realize that an image has a history of its own, does that make it feel less powerful to you, or does it actually make it more interesting? For me, it's almost always the second one, but I want to hear from you. So let's bring this full circle. We started with a question: what did Jesus really look like? And what we found is that the answer isn't simple, because it never really was. The Bible doesn't tell us. The earliest art gives us conflicting signals. History and science point us toward a man who looked like what he almost certainly was, a first-century Jewish man from the Middle East, shaped by that land, that climate, and that world. But the image most people carry today, that image was shaped over centuries by artists in distant places, by the spread of a religion across cultures, by the very human desire to see the sacred in a face that felt familiar. That doesn't make those images dishonest, it makes them human. It makes them a record of how different people in different times tried to reach towards something they believed was beyond ordinary life. But it does mean that the image most of us grew up with is not the same as a historical photograph. It's an interpretation, one of many, one that became dominant because of a very specific set of historical circumstances. And knowing that doesn't have to take anything away from you. It can simply add a new layer of understanding, a more complete picture. So here's my final question for you today. Was the image of Jesus we grew up with an accurate one? Or was it always just one version of a much bigger, more complicated story? Tell me what you think in the comments, and be honest, because the most interesting conversations happen when people actually say what they're really thinking. If this kind of deep historical exploration is something you want more of, this channel is going to keep going deeper, because the further back into ancient history you go, the more surprising details you start to find, details that most people never hear about. And the next one might surprise you even more. See you there.